Amid the chaos that consumed America in the summer of 2020, already with normal social life suppressed and the economy taking a major hit in response to an officially declared pandemic, followed by nearly nightly riots, looting, and arson across dozens of cities for months on end, an obscure academic came to public notice. Peter Turchin, an evolutionary anthropologist who uses mathematical modeling, came to the attention of the media on the strength of his 2010 prediction that the 2020s were going to be a decade of turmoil and violence for the country. And while Turchin saw 2020 as a milestone for the emergence of the crisis, he didn't anticipate any turn for the better as long as what he identified as the causes of the crisis continued. Increasing disparities in wealth, decades-long stagnation in working-class wages, and the overproduction of a volatile surplus elite. Basing his analysis on such demographic and economic indicators, Turchin has raised the prospect that the current decade could be ushering in for America a revolution or a civil war. Turchin, though, has not been the only scholar pointing into this same time period as posing an existential threat to the United States. Despite similar educational backgrounds, William Strauss, with a master's degree in public policy, and Neil Howe, with a master's degree in economics and history, take quite a different approach in their book, The Fourth Turning. They emphasize the cultural and psychological effects upon subsequent generations of the impacts following from recurring social processes. Emphasizing how the ideas of the Enlightenment has encouraged modern people to think of the world in terms of linear time, they point out that in fact the cyclical time, which has always informed human life, continues to inform our experience of the world. The turning of the seasons, the turning of the generations. The attitudes typical of generations that share a common distance removed from historical events leads them to have similar responses that lead them to act in ways that either avoid or ultimately recreate such events. They point to a 4-generation cycle composed of approximately 85 years, each of which can be said to end with a crisis. This is a particular way of looking at the matter, of course. Like the constant churn of solstices and equinoxes across an earthly year, there's an objective beginning or end. But if you choose the winter solstice as your beginning point, the cycle is complete when you get back to the next winter solstice. Also, the precise number of years is a little flexible. The claim isn't that nature operates according to a stopwatch, but except in extremely rare circumstances, it is the 4th generation removed from a crisis that ushers in the next crisis. A full unpacking of Strauss's and Howe's argument is more detailed than is justified for the purposes here. What's been said so far should be sufficient for now looking at their application of this analysis to the history of the United States. Looking back across the country's history, they note the appearance of crises, partially defined by how they changed the nature of the country moving forward, and appearing consistent with their 4-generational cycle. The first of these is the extended crisis of the Depression and World War II, to which they attribute the climax year of 1944. They then look back 81 years to the crisis of the Civil War, with its climax year of 1863. Then they look back another 82 years to the crisis prior to the Civil War, the American Revolution, with its climax year of 1781. So, we see through the lens of their analysis that the history of the U.S. has been punctuated by 3 major crises, reshaping the country every 4 generations. Parenthetically, some viewers here might object to their exclusion of World War I. That was my initial reaction at first, too. However, remember, their point is that their crises every 4 generations are ones that change the nature of American society. While World War I most definitely radically changed society in Europe, not such a strong case can be made for this in the United States. Certainly, the post-World War I period saw a rise of technocracy and what I've called elsewhere the rule of the managerial class. Check out my book linked in the video notes below for more on this. In the private sector, this process, though, preceded the war by decades, and in the public sector, it was still decades more away from being consolidated. So Strauss and Howe are probably justified as treating World War I as more of a sideshow to the slow evolution of American society, more like the Spanish-American or Vietnam Wars. The logic of their analysis is then that if they're correct about the idea that every fourth generation is prone to get itself into such socially disruptive crises, it should be possible for them to turn in the other direction and in fact make predictions about the future. With their book being published in 1997, they forecast over a quarter of a century into the future and predict the rough timing of the next, fourth turning, the next major American crisis, as appearing in 2025. Though, if we were to use their rough 85-year time interval, measuring from the climax year of the last crisis, the climax year of the next crisis would be expected to be in 2029. In any event, clearly the logic of their analysis provides a forecast for the next major crisis, the previous three, all of which were wars, in a time frame entirely consistent with Peter Turchin's more recent and methodologically different forecast. Further, this would be a crisis which, as we saw, he too conceded could be a revolution or civil war. If you're inclined to dismiss this striking overlap of forecasts, despite the differences in disciplines, methodology, and temporal perspectives, as a mere coincidence, there's a third source arriving at the same forecast. John Glubb was a truly unique character, living the life that one might have imagined for his more famous counterpart, T.E. Lawrence. He lived over 3 decades in the Arab world, partially in Iraq, mostly in Jordan. He was a highly decorated military man, honored by both his home country, Britain, and Jordan, the country in whose military and police he served for 3 decades. After his time serving in Jordan ended in 1956, he began a second career as a scholar, mostly writing histories of the Arab peoples and their empires. There were over a dozen such books, plus several more with a biographical perspective. Based upon perhaps partially his personal experience, but mostly his scholarly experience, toward the end of his life, in 1979, he published a booklet titled The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival. Once one has read it, the second half of the title seems like an odd inclusion. Clearly, though, the work is an attempt to provide a carefully considered examination of the fate of empires. He concedes that he doesn't know so well the histories of the empires of the East, such as in China, but cites the dozen empires of the West whose history he does know well and draws upon for his analysis. While Glubb doesn't emphasize the timeless cycles of life in such a prominent matter as do Strauss and Howe, there's certainly an element of this at work in his own assessment of the fate of empires. He describes empires as cycling through a series of stages. The pioneers, when a previously unnoticed people boldly burst upon the world stage. Conquest, when they assert themselves and build their empire. Commerce, the period during which the imposition of consistent governance and law across a large territory gives rise to increased trade and prosperity. Affluence, in which prosperity has conquered scarcity to such a degree that the empire's people feel relieved from the demands of nature. Decadence, when that disconnection from nature contributes to a flourishing of selfishness and the communal values that animated the pioneers are lost, followed by the final fall, though this doesn't always look exactly the same across empires. The interesting thing, from my perspective, though, is that as Glubb looks at the unfolding of these processes across the history of empires, he finds that they turn out to have a remarkably similar time trajectory. Of course, the timing is not exact. For Glubb, too, history is not following a stopwatch. There is some variety, but on average, the many empires he examines seem to last, from pioneers to decadent fall, about 250 years. And certainly, in some cases, some might quibble with his timing. He acknowledges not everyone would agree with his decision to separate the Roman Republic and Empire into separate empires. Personally, I find this distinction justified in the larger context of his analysis, but even if you chose to call that an outlier, the periodizing of these empires remains remarkably striking. Also of interest, he points out that this 250-year average for empires remains the norm over many millennia. He starts with the Assyrian Empire in 859 BC. Neither the speed of transportation nor the nature of the weapons used seem to change the life cycle of the fate of empires. The Assyrians, marching on foot and fighting with spears and bows and arrows, saw their empire's trajectory pretty much match that of the British Empire, which he marks from 1700 to 1950, and who operated with artillery and railways. Before continuing with this comparative analysis, it would be timely here to address a few thoughts to the idea of the American Empire. While such a phrase is more commonly used to describe the rise of U.S. hegemonic power following World War II, with the expansion of its monetary, commercial, and military systems across the globe, this is too narrow a focus. In fact, the American Empire started with its expansion across the continent of North America. Without the military conquest of the seceding southern states during the Civil War, the American Empire as we know it today wouldn't exist. Likewise, without the military conquest of the Western territories, including the conquest of the Apache lands, as well as the successful military annexation of Texas from Mexico, the American Empire as we know it today wouldn't exist. It was only after consolidation across the continent that this consolidated American Empire began flexing its muscle off in other places, removed from the continental mainland. Indeed, there are grounds for calling this, in fact, a Yankee Puritan empire, which eventually took on the visage of an American empire, but that's a discussion for another day. From this perspective, then, it is fair to say that the American Empire got its start with the initial achievement of sovereignty over its original continental territory with the American Revolution, or War of Independence. This context should be kept in mind as we return to our discussion of Glubb's analysis of the fate of empires. Glubb does not include an American empire in his list near the beginning of the booklet. He does, though, acknowledge in passing on a couple of occasions the existence of such an American empire. And his analysis dovetails nicely with the description of an American empire just provided. If, though, Glubb's 250-year cycle for empires strikes you as a misfit with the analyses that have been considered so far, consider that Strauss and Howe's 4 generational cycles of approximately 85 years fit quite nicely into Glubb's periodization. 3 of those 85-year cycles added together equals 255 years. Plus, of course, each of these scholars acknowledge some flexibility in periodicity. In fact, if you consider that Strauss and Howe's first 2 cycles, the American Revolution to the Civil War and the Civil War to World War II, were actually a little less than 85 full years each, the third, which they anticipate for the late 2020s, would seem to be right on schedule with Glubb's. If we accept Strauss and Howe's choice of 1781 as the climax year for the first American formational crisis, the war that laid the foundation for the American Empire, then, using Glubb's cycle period, 250 years later would land us in 2031, just 2 years later than what would be Strauss and Howe's climax year for the next crisis in the next 4th turning. And the connections between the analysis of these scholars doesn't end there either. Returning Peter Turchin back into the analysis in a different book, War and Peace and War, The Rise and Fall of Empires, focusing now not on America but the history of empires, he too identifies a key cycle. He calls this a secular cycle. In this cycle, like Glubb, he identifies an initial people bursting upon the stage of history. He sees them eventually imposing stability and peace, giving rise to prosperity. Over time, though, the initial bonds of the emergent empire, what he calls asabaya, erode in the face of the selfish pursuit of financial gain. Wealth disparity grows between the rich and the poor, and even the elites fall into conflict over the increasing concentration of wealth. Eventually, the empire deteriorates into civil war among the elites or rebellion by the poor. Collapse follows. These integrative and disintegrative phases constitute a complete secular cycle. And according to Turchin, a secular cycle lasts, quote, around 2 or 3 centuries, end quote. In other words, on average, about 250 years. And to be clear, a word search of the electronic version of Turchin's book shows no reference to Glubb. There's really no reason to assume he ever even came across Glubb's modest little booklet, and yet they arrive at remarkably similar conclusions in their assessment of the life cycle of empires. So, if we accept the American Revolution as the start of the American Empire, we find here multiple analyses from different scholars working in different disciplines, using different methodologies, writing at different times, who all arrive at pretty close to the very same forecast. In the latter 2020s or very early 2030s, the U.S. will be facing a major crisis in the manner of a revolution or civil war, which will transform the nature of its society and likely will entail the fall of the American Empire. This obviously doesn't constitute a decisive, airtight case for such an eventuality, but neither is it just random speculation. If you're completely dismissive of the idea that there is a cyclical dimension to the human condition, an ardent devotee of the Enlightenment's linear time, as Strauss and Howe might say, then you'll just have to take your chances with a more random approach to the coming decade. However, it's not only the timing schedules which we might rely upon in this. Again, basing himself on his decades of scholarship studying empires, Glubb also identifies certain key features that usually appear in the final decades of an empire before it falls. So, how familiar does this sound to you? In addition to the tendency towards an affluence that paves the way for pursuit of individual self-aggrandizement and enrichment, at the cost of the founding communal values, noted by Turchin, Glubb also points to several other traits. To be clear, he emphasizes that these events are not necessarily the cause of the collapse, though they can contribute, but may be best considered as symptoms or indicators. The first is the increasing presence of what we today call a welfare state, an effort to mitigate the previously mentioned wealth disparities. Also, there is an influx of foreigners. While the geographic expanse of an empire may well include diverse peoples under its governance, this observation refers to an influx of foreigners into the metropole, or capital of the empire. The spirit of public service erodes. A decadent sensuality, frivolity, the smiley face of pessimism characterizes life in the declining decades. Popular sports and entertainment gain a currency they'd never had in the early phases of the empire. The latter particularly accompanies a degeneracy of sexual mores. There is an increased role and influence of women in public life. Ideological attitudes and temperaments harden. Different governance or legal institutions abroad are regarded with scorn, and domestic political differences become increasingly bitter and uncompromising. A decline in religion is also observed, though the situation may be more complicated than it first appears. Perhaps it is only traditional religions that decline, while less structured forms of spiritualism spread. This all strikes me as conjuring an accurate picture of America today. Whether we find such a society normal or even desirable, it should be borne in mind is beside the point. After all, as products ourselves of a declining empire, this is what we'd be expected to expect. And many of us would be expected to enjoy it. It isn't that these conditions are inherently good or bad, they are simply the ones that characterize the twilight of an empire's collapse. There may be plenty of people who, for perfectly good reasons, may welcome that collapse. So one might greet such conditions enthusiastically as an occasion of indulgence or redemption. The cycles of empire are indifferent to our emotional responses. To better grasp this attitude toward the decline of empire, and indeed to better understand the very nature of the phases in the cycle of an empire, one needs access to analyses which are not provided by any of the scholars discussed here. What's needed is the insight provided by the evolutionary lens of biological realism. That's the missing link to fully make sense of what is happening in these empire cycles, what it means for America in the decades to come, and how best to weather the approaching storm of empire collapse. That's what we'll address in the second installment of this analysis of the twilight of the American empire.